Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to the ISO 9001-2015 Introduction to the World's Most Popular Standard. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager for PJR. Just a few notes for everyone. All of our participants today are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions, so please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not this presentation will be made available after we're finished. We do make these presentations available in two key ways. First, if you would like to have a copy of the slides, those are going to be made available for download on the website, pjr.com, shortly after we're finished. And if you're interested in rewatching this webinar with the voiceover, that is also available. We host all of our prior recorded webinars on our YouTube page, and there's a link for that on our website as well. You'll just look for the tab Previously Recorded Webinars. In terms of our topics for today, we're going to take a look at what is ISO 9001 and what is it all about. And I facilitate that primarily by deconstructing the scope statement. And we're going to get into why the scope statement is such an important piece of what ISO 9001 is truly all about. We're also going to explore where the ISO standards come from, not just ISO 9001, but all of the ISO standards. We're going to review how ISO 9001 was affected by the development of an item called Annex SL. We'll then continue with a cover-to-cover review of what's where in ISO 9001. I've got a rather detailed section on what I call key ideas within ISO 9001. So if you're brand new to ISO 9001, this section is intended to kind of highlight in plain language what's going on and what some of the key ideas are. We'll have a few concluding remarks and then your questions at the end. So what is ISO 9001? Well, its official title is Quality Management Systems Requirements. And in terms of what it's all about, this is really where the scope of the standard is helpful. And the scope is found in Section 1, and this statement is unchanged in the last three editions of ISO 9001. You'd have to go back all the way back to the 1994 standard to find even a variation on this statement. So I've got it reproduced here. And it states that this international standard specifies requirements for a quality management system when an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to consistently provide products and services that meet customer as well as applicable statutory and regulatory requirements and aims to enhance customer satisfaction through the effective application of the system, including processes for improvement of the system and the assurance of conformity to customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Now that's a mouthful, obviously. So let's go ahead and take this in smaller bites. So the first statement is this international standard specifies requirements for a quality management system. Now this opening statement establishes a key aspect of what ISO 9001 is and what it is not. ISO 9001 is not a product standard. It does not tell you how to manufacture your product or how to render your service. It is a standard that is built on the idea of developing a quality management system. So any organization that seeks ISO 9001 certification, you are still expected to define for yourself how you're going to make and control the products that you manufacture. The second part of the scope states when an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to consistently provide products and services. And that is also key, the fact that they've added the term services to the scope statement. Now, if you go back to the first two editions of ISO 9001, the 88 and 94 versions, at that time, it was thought that ISO 9001 was going to be primarily for companies that make tangible products. Now, as the time has gone on, it became clear that there was a wider base of organizations that would benefit from ISO 9001 certification, hence the inclusion of the term "and services." The scope statement then continues that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements and aim to enhance customer satisfaction. Now that brings in really what's probably one of the central cornerstones of ISO 9001, and that is the aspect of customer requirements, that we need to be attuned and receptive and responsive to the needs of the customers. That's critical for success in ISO 9001. Through the effective application of the system, including processes for improvement of the system and the assurance of conformity to customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. And these last bits get at the idea of a system as an ongoing item. It's not something that you implement and forget about. And then obviously this idea of improvement. And that definitely foreshadows the importance of improvement on how ISO 9001 was written as a standard and how it is audited. So in terms of where these standards come from, where the terminology comes from and so forth, ISO stands for International Organization for Standardization. Now that's not a direct translation. The terms that are used for it are rooted in a different language, which is why it isn't IOS. But in either case, the ISO, their job, their task is to write standards for a variety of topics. And there are hundreds of standards that they've published on various requirements in various topics. Now, each of these standards is assigned to a committee, and if it's a management system standard, it is assigned to a technical committee. Now, the technical committee for ISO 9001 is TC 176, and TC 176 includes membership from each of the major industrialized nations. It's a huge committee, and here in the United States, our representation comes from the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI. So to get a sense of why the standard is ordered in the way that it is and why they put things where they did, it's important that we consider a document that was developed 3 years prior to ISO 9001 2015 being published, and that is Annex SL. Now, Annex SL, you may have heard at the time, it was called the High-Level Outline, or Annex XL. It is part of a larger ISO publication, and it is an annex, as the name would imply. It's not a standalone document, but rather it is part of what's called Directives Part 1, Procedure Specific to ISO. So it's a self-imposed set of requirements for how technical committees and so forth are supposed to develop these standards. Now, if you're so inclined, you can read Directives Part 1 yourself. It's actually a public domain document. It's available for free on the ISO website. Now, Annex SL was first written back in 2012, and it was written by a group called the Joint Technical Coordination Group. And what it is a 10-section blueprint, if you will, on how the ISO family of standards are going to be written. And what we get from it, among other things, are common terms, core definitions, and a established framework in terms of where the requirements reside. Now, at this point in mid-2020, just about every standard that ISO writes has completed its transition to the Annex SL format. Now, we have some that are still in the midst of their transition timeframes. I believe a couple of the environmental health and safety standards are still into next year or perhaps even 2022 in terms of the transition deadlines. But for the most part, the work is done in terms of the standards being published. So this is an example of how Annex SL works. So I've pulled Clause 921, which has to do with internal audits. Now on the left, you can see the text that's given in Annex SL. And I'm sure you can see there are X's in a couple of places. And on the right, where we have ISO 9001, you can see where those X's have been replaced with the term quality. So where it says provide information on whether the blank management system, well, if it's for ISO 9001, it's going to be information on whether the quality management system. Also, you'll note in the second bullet there under subset A, it says the requirements of this international standard, this part of ISO, or this technical specification. So it kind of gives you some options. So this is an example of where the text within ISO 9001 comes from. Now, Annex SL includes a total of 7 auditable sections. And these begin with Section 4, and they run 4 through 10. So in Section 4, we have what's called context of the organization. And there's a number of high-level requirements in here. Establishing what is this organization? Who are the interested parties? What is the scope of the system for this organization? And what are the processes that make up the quality management system? In sections 5 and 6, we have requirements related to leadership. This is where we find the roles of management defined. The quality policy statement is established here. Having to have a method for defining responsibility is found here. In section 6, we have the primary placeholder for the risk requirement, and also the requirements related to quality objectives. Section 7 is entitled Support, and there's a lot of different things that are collected into Section 7. This is where we find training requirements, training record requirements. It's also actually where you will find the calibration requirements. So things related to measurement devices are in Section 7. Documentation requirements are in Section 7. Record requirements are housed in Section 7. So you can think of Sections 4, 5, 6, and 7 as foundation. And when we get to Section 8, Section 8 is called Operation. And this is where we capture the real day-to-day items. And they follow a natural progression. We have how a product or service might be marketed and sold, how it might be designed, what we do to purchase outside services or products, controlling the production or service process, inspecting the outputs, and then if we have non-conforming outputs, what controls are in place for those items. So a lot of the day-to-day items are in Section 8, and if the auditor is doing their job, a majority of audit time is going to be spent in Section 8. The auditable portion then concludes with Section 9 and 10. Section 9 is called Performance Evaluation. All of the various ways in which your system are going to be evaluated or captured here. So this is where we find internal audit, customer satisfaction, management review, and so forth, all in Section 9. Section 10 is a very brief section. It's called improvement. This is a placeholder for continual improvement, certainly, but also for the larger idea of improvement. And it is also where you will find the corrective action requirement. Now, to give you a more in-depth understanding of how the standard is organized, the standard begins in Section 0.1 with an overview statement. And this is kind of a theme. There's a couple of areas, themes that come up a few times. In 0.1, it gives some preliminary discussion on risk-based thinking, on the plan, do, check, act cycle. And we also have official definitions for some terms that are used in the standard. Now, the most important of these, of course, is the term shall. A shall is understood as a mandatory requirement. So whenever you read the word shall in ISO 9001, if you are not doing that item, that is grounds for a nonconformance in the context of the audit. Now, if you see the term should, and in ISO 9001, there are no uses of the term should within the auditable content. That is understood as a recommendation. The term may is permission, and the term can is a possibility or capability. The introduction section continues with section 0.2. And this is where we have a reference to the 7 quality management principles. Now, these are found in the ISO 9000 standard, that is fundamentals and vocabulary. And these ideas, the intent is that these ideas were encompassed in the writing of ISO 9001. These are kind of the root ideas. Section 0.3 is called process approach. It emphasizes the importance of the process approach in the development and execution of the system, and it reinforces the plan, do, check, act cycle and provides an improved graphic for that cycle. In section 033, we have further discussion on the idea of risk-based thinking. We'll see that again a little bit later. Section 0.4 explores the relationship with the other 2 management system standards. Those are ISO 9000 and 9004, the improvement standard. Then we finally get down to the numbered sections. Now, we've already explored section 1, scope. So let's talk a little bit about section 2 and 3. Section 2 establishes a normative reference link to ISO 9000. Now, what that means is that in the context of an audit, the definitions that appear in ISO 9000, the fundamentals and vocabulary standard, are binding. These are officially binding definitions within the context of an audit. So that's why section 2 is written in the manner that it is written. Now, section 3 is called, ironically, terms and definitions. Now, this is an Annex SL placeholder, if you will. Right now, there are no official terms used within ISO 9001 that don't already appear in the 9000 document. Now, if that ever changes, section 3 may be used to provide those definitions. Now, if you read other standards that ISO publishes, such as 45001 or 14001, there are some official definitions given in section 3. Now, we've already reviewed sections 4 through 10 and how those are laid out, so let's continue with Annex A. Now, Annex A is an interesting part of ISO 9001, and anyone that is new to reading ISO 9001, I've always encouraged folks to pay very close attention to these 8 items that are found in Annex A. Because again, they're written into the standard, and therefore they are officially binding. And for the most part, the things that are here are intended to help the users, the folks that implement ISO 9001. So what's in here? So Annex A1 is called Structure and Terminology. And this essentially states that if you are implementing ISO 9001, first of all, you don't have to align any documentation you choose to have to match ISO 9001. So in other words, if you choose to have a procedure, for example, for something like management review, there is no requirement that you have to number that procedure, procedure 9.3. There's no reason for that whatsoever. And if you choose to have a procedure that covers only part of what's found in a particular clause of the standard, that's okay too. And furthermore, you're not even required to use the official terms from the standard. Good example of that would be suppliers. Now, the term suppliers, I'm sure most of us on the call today know that term. Well, that term's not used in ISO 9001. ISO 9001 refers to those kinds of parties as external providers. Well, fine, but that doesn't mean that you have to stop calling them suppliers. So all of that is captured in Annex A1. Now in A2, there is a further exploration of the idea that the term product is meant to be understood as products and services, and hence in this version of the standard it is written out as products and services. In Annex A3, there's some further discussion on what they mean by interested parties. We're actually going to be visiting that topic a little bit later in our presentation today. Annex A4 talks about risk-based thinking, and it makes it official that an organization is not required or obligated to have a formal risk management process, and that is key. That is still, even now in 2020, a misconception that is out there. This idea that in order to meet the requirement, you somehow have to have a formal risk management process. You don't. And it's even been written into the standard to that extent. In Annex A5, we have a statement on applicability. This gets into the fact that in the standard you are permitted to claim what they call a non-applicable. In the older versions of the standard, these were referred to as exclusions. The idea that any part of the standard that is not something that you've implemented that doesn't apply to you can be claimed as an exemption. In Section A6, we have a topic, documented information. There's a little bit more discussion here on this term and how it replaced the phrases procedure, record, and document. A7 is entitled Organizational Knowledge. This is an exploration of what is, at the time the standard was published, a new requirement and how this requirement is supposed to be fulfilled. And then finally, we have A8, which is control of externally provided products and services. And this gives a little more detail on what we mean by an external provider and what you're supposed to do with those parties. The standard then concludes with Annex B, which gives some discussion on the relationship between ISO 9001 and several other ISO publications, including the 9004, 10001, and other standards. And then it wraps up with a bibliography. Now, there's a lot there. Obviously, we've kind of covered this in a very textbook fashion. But as I mentioned in the lead-in to the presentation today, there's ways to read the standard and understand what the key ideas are. So For anyone that is brand new to ISO 9001, I always like to emphasize that there are really 5 key ideas at play in this standard. To understand ISO 9001 is to understand these 5 key ideas. And those are scope, processes, accountability, effectiveness, and improvement. So let's begin with scope. Now, early on in the standard, in section 4.3, the organization is directed to develop what's referred to as a scope statement. Now, a scope statement is, you can think of a scope statement as the extent and boundaries of your management system. So here's a few examples. Design, fabrication, and assembly of collapsible tripads. Distribution of fasteners, plating, heat treating, and sorting of metal stampings. When you write your scope, you are establishing what have I built this quality management system for? When the auditors come, what is it they're going to be looking at? Now, the scope statement that you develop will eventually, hopefully, be the same as what's shown in your ISO 9001:2015 certificate issued by PJR. Now, bear in mind, it does not have to be a word-for-word match, but it should be very close. And furthermore, do not list an item on your scope that won't be available for audit. So, for example, if you have field installation in your scope statement, we need to be able to audit that field installation activity if it's going to be listed on the certificate. If you have new equipment that isn't up and running yet, we can't add it to the scope if we can't audit it, and that's a very key thing to remember. I'd also like to caution you to be careful about being too wordy in your scope statement. Let me give you an example. Let's say that an organization has this as their scope statement: laser cutting, water jet cutting, progressive die cutting, plating, heat treating, and distribution of flanges, springs, shims, bolts, and barrels. Now, if that's the scope statement you have, in our audit, we've got to audit everything. We have to audit laser cutting, water jet cutting, progressive die cutting, plating, heat treating, and distribution. And we also have to make sure that we sample every one of those product groups: flanges, springs, shims, bolts, and barrels. The more condensed you can be when writing a scope statement, the better. Our second key idea is that of processes. And this is also mentioned early in the standards. It's section 4.4. And the idea is that a quality management system is made up of processes. Now, the idea of processes, this is a key idea. We've actually got a whole separate webinar on just this topic. It's entitled The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. So I'd like to invite you to tune in for that webinar if you have not joined us for that one in the past. Now, the concept of processes flows throughout the standard. I've got some key examples here to highlight for you. Process approach gets mentioned in section 511D. That is the management clause. Quality objectives need to be aligned with processes. That comes up in section 621. Staff need to be competent for their processes. That's discussed in section 7 in a few places. You need to have effective infrastructure for your processes. That comes in section 713, and so forth. Now, when you're developing your processes, we encourage you to make your processes as personal and unique to your business as possible, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's going to help improve your sense of ownership of the system. If the processes are highly recognizable, you're going to have buy-in, you're going to have a sense of ownership. If you choose to make them just replications of the statements that appear within the standard, then really are these your processes? That's the key thing you need to ask yourself. The third key idea that is found in ISO 9001 is accountability. And ISO 9001 requires that all persons that fall within the scope of the system be included. And so that means, and that starts with top management. Up in 511, it says that top management needs to make itself accountable. That term is actually used in 511. They are accountable for the effectiveness of the system. Now, accountability is mentioned in a couple of other key places. In Section 8.6, it says that any product release records have to name names. Who is the person that released this product for delivery to the customer? If there are problems, we need to respond to those with systemic corrective action, Section 10.2. You're required to define roles and responsibilities in Section 5.3. And personnel need to be cognizant of the quality policy, 522B, and how they contribute to the effectiveness of the quality management system, 7.3. Lots of key areas here. Our fourth key idea is effectiveness. And this comes up in so many places, this idea that you need to measure the effectiveness of something. You know, the big idea here is that you should know at any given time how well or how poorly you're doing. You should have your finger on the pulse, so to speak, for how things are going within your operation. Now, the basic idea is initially established in 441C, and here's what it says. You need to determine and apply the criteria and methods, which are going to include monitoring, measuring, and performance indicators that are needed to ensure the effective operation and control of your processes. So again, here's two ideas blending together, processes and effectiveness. Now, there's a lot of areas where effectiveness is mentioned. We talk about tracking quality objectives, 621. Ensuring that competency actions are effective, 7.2. Ensuring that our external providers are effective, 8.4. Ensuring that we're achieving customer satisfaction, 912. That we're watching the overall trends in the system, 913. An overall assessment through the internal audit process, 9.2. The management review process in 9.3, and then improvement efforts in 10.1. Our fifth and final key idea is improvement. Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is an idea that flows down from the scope statement. And improvement as a topic evolved from an older concept that was called continual improvement. Now, the current idea of improvement is that continual improvement is part of a myriad of approaches. You know, we can talk about reactive changes. We can talk about breakthroughs. And the idea is that we should be seeking improvement wherever possible within the quality management system. Now, improvement is primarily discussed in Section 10.1. 10.1 states that the organization needs to determine and select opportunities for improvement and implement any necessary actions to meet customer requirements and enhance customer satisfaction. Now, like other key ideas that we've talked about today, improvement gets reviewed over and over again throughout the standard. It comes up in Section 4.4, where it again iterates. An organization needs to continually improve its quality management system. It comes up in 5.1.1, where it says that management needs to promote improvement. It comes up in 5.2.1, where it states that the quality policy needs to address continual improvement. In 5.3c, it says that you need to assign responsibilities that include reporting on improvement opportunities. In 6.11d, it states that your risk action efforts should target improvement. In 7.11, it says that you should provide resources to achieve continual improvement. In 7.3, it states that people that work for the organization should be aware that their efforts impact improvement. And then in 9.3.2f, it says that your management review should include discussion of opportunities for improvement. So in conclusion, ISO 9001:2015 is still the world's most utilized standard. There are over 1.3 million registered companies worldwide. And any organization that is seeking certification would do well to bear in mind the big picture of what ISO 9001:2015 is seeking to promote. Now, if you're ready for a deeper dive, we also offer a clause-by-clause course. Now, if you're brand new to ISO 9001 and you want to have someone walk you through the standard, word by word, clause by clause, and explain it to you, this course is for you. It's entitled ISO 9001:2015, a clause-by-clause analysis. This course can be found on our website, and it is 100% free. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. I mentioned the Interaction of Processes webinar a little bit earlier in the presentation. We also have a special presentation on non-applicable clauses, which is another topic we explored briefly today. And then finally, my second ISO 9001 presentation, anticipating auditor expectations in key areas. Lots of good content to share with you. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is to opt in. And that can be done by visiting our website at www.pjr.com. If you go to the bottom of the page, input your email address and click subscribe, you'll be automatically opted in for news updates and other points of interest. I do thank you for your time. I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard. And it looks like we do have some questions. Jillian Johnson asks, where can you find a free copy of Annex SL? Well, Jillian, the best way to do that is to just bring up Google or your preferred search engine and just input ISO Directives Part 1 Annex SL, follow the links, and you'll be able to download it for free. Janice Toller asks, how many versions of ISO are there? Well, Janice, currently, there is only one version of ISO 9001 that is official, and that is ISO 9001:2015. Now, there were 4 prior revisions, the 1988, the 1994, the 2000, and the 2008 revisions. Those revisions are now withdrawn, and companies can no longer be certified to those revisions. Amit Panwar asks, do we have to show implementation of ISO 9001 in our processes and work before we can request a stage 1 review? Do we need to show we conducted management review to satisfy ISO requirements, or just show we have a management review process in place would suffice for stage 1 and stage 2 approval? Great questions. Amit, you are required to have a fully implemented ISO 9001 system, including management review, to successfully pass your stage 2 audit. Now, in terms of the stage 1 review, there are some allowances in terms of having things planned and scheduled and so forth, but absolutely you have to have a fully implemented system in order to be successful at the stage 2. Srinivasa Perumal Elumalai asks, how do you define your QMS processes? Well, this is going to vary a bit from company to company, but bear in mind that your processes should be your own. These should be processes that you recognize as being part of your company. Beyond that basic explanation, you may need to enlist the services of a consultant. Don Landy asks, how should you decide who an authorized vendor is? Well, Don, the standard is open in terms of how an organization can define what it means to be an approved supplier or not an approved supplier. So I can't tell you precisely how to go about doing that, but I can tell you that the organization is permitted to define its own process on how that's going to be done. And then obviously that'll get looked at in the context of the audit process. Stephen Hawk asks, have you heard of any planned updates to the standard? Not that I'm aware of currently. I know there are some ongoing discussions on the content of Annex SL, but as of right now, I am not aware of any pending updates to ISO 9001. Senivasa Purumal Elumalai also asks, is each quality management system process objective required? Interesting question. Yes, you are required to have measures of effectiveness for each process. However, it is permitted that you might have a process measure that works for multiple processes. Senifasa also asks, do all instruments have to be calibrated, or is internal verification enough? That's a very specific question that you're asking. I will tell you that measurement devices that are used for the inspection of product need to be traceable to national standards. There are a variety of ways that that can be accomplished. If you need a more detailed answer than that, you're probably going to need to work with a consultant. Mark Mashofsky asks, when is the ISO 9001 standard to be revised again? I'm afraid I don't know, Mark. The time frame, there are, I believe, official bylaws that they go by at the ISO for when standards need to be considered for revision. As to what those time frames are, that is not information that I'm privy to. Are there any final questions today? Okay, very good. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day, everyone.